Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone on behalf of the Watershed Security Fund, a partnership with the First Nations Water Caucus, the First Nations Fisheries Council, and the Real Estate Foundation of BC, to our first webinar session here. So this is our first webinar session for the Watershed Security Fund. So already a couple bumps with the chat this morning, and appreciate your patience with that. We are recording this session, and it will be shared on the website as a resource afterwards, as well as we'll be going through and we'll chat about this a little bit later. But if there's any questions that we don't get around to during this, we'll be sure to either follow up or put some info into the frequently asked questions section of our website. Keep that up to date so that everyone's in the loop with any answers or things like that. So just to start, I'll introduce myself, and then we'll just do a round of introductions for the rest of the panelists, and continue to welcome you all to introduce yourselves in the chat as we've been doing, which is really wonderful. It's great to see a range of people here. But my name is Jenna Duncan. I'm the acting senior manager for the Habitat and Environmental Protection sector at the First Nations Fisheries Council of BC, and with the Fisheries Council being the secretariat for the First Nations Water Caucus. Maybe I'll pass it to Leanne if you want to introduce yourself next.
Thanks, Jenna, and thanks to everybody for joining us this morning. It's really great to be here with you all. My name is Leanne Sexsmith, and I'm the Director of Strategic Programs and Partnerships with the Real Estate Foundation. I'm joining you from my home office today on unceded Squamish Nation territory. And yeah, I've been with the foundation for a long time. Some of you may have been familiar with me in my work on the Healthy Watersheds Initiative, and now the Foundation's really excited and proud to be partnering with the First Nations Water Caucus and First Nations Fisheries Council and the Watershed Security Fund. And yeah, so welcome and thank you for being here. And I'll pass it over to Adarshana.
Thank you, Leanne. Good morning, everyone. My name is Adarshana, and I'm the Program Coordinator for the Watershed Security Fund. I'm calling in today from the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat, Seneca, and Mississaugas of the Credit. I'm really looking forward to our webinar today, where we look forward to sharing wonderful insights in our Watershed Security Fund. I'll pass it on to Cheyenne.
Hi, everyone. It's lovely to have you here this morning. My name is Cheyenne Berchen-Hanehauen. I'm one of the communications managers with the Real Estate Foundation of BC, and am supporting and leading some of the communications and marketing for the Watershed Security Fund. And I'm calling in from the traditional unceded territories of the Lekwungen speaking people. I'll pass it off to Jennifer.
Thanks, Cheyenne, and welcome everyone. My name is Jennifer Archer, and I'm Watershed Security Senior Project Specialist with the Real Estate Foundation of BC, and I'm zooming in today from the traditional unceded territories of the Stundaimuk First Nation and the Nanaimo Watershed. So happy to be here and to share the information we've got with you today. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for your intros, and thanks everyone for the continued introductions in the chat. So I just wanted to go over some of the objectives for the webinar today, and then I'll pass it over to Jennifer for a bit of an orientation before we get into presentations and questions and answers and all of that good stuff. So by the end of the webinar, we're hoping to have shared some more information about the Watershed Security Fund and its newly developed grants program. We hope to have provided helpful information about the first intake and grant application process, and have heard and responded to some of your questions and gained insights from your questions and comments about areas to further clarify or consider for this intake or future intakes. And in the weeks ahead, we'll be updating our application guide to address questions raised today, and we'll be sharing feedback from the webinar with our grants working group, which we will explain a little bit later in one of the slides who our grants working group is. And yeah, as I mentioned, this is our first webinar for the Watershed Security Fund, so appreciate your patience as we figure things out and go through this process. And this initiative is new and innovative, and we are looking to have multiple intakes. So as we go forward, appreciate opportunities to adapt and learn from your questions so we can continue to make improvements in the future and help this intake and future intakes for the Watershed Security Fund. So I will pass it to Jennifer.
Great, thanks, Jenna. I'm just going to share my screen here and share just a little orientation around our agenda and the format for questions today. We will have about 3 primary focus areas for our presentations today. And the first is going to be an overview of the Watershed Security Fund, just a general overview of the work that's happened to date, and that'll be about 10 minutes. And then we'll have a few minutes to field some questions afterwards. And then Leanne's going to provide an overview of the grants program. That'll be about a 10 to 15 minute presentation. And again, we'll have an opportunity to field some questions after that. And then finally, Leanne's also going to share some information about the grants program approach, the application process, and some application guidance. And that'll be about 15 minutes. As far as the format for today, because we have so many people online and we're really excited about that, but just to make it easy and functional, we're going to ask that you put your questions as you're listening to the presentations, that you put them in the Q&A box, and you should be able to see a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen beside the chat icon. And if you can put your questions in there, that'll allow us an opportunity to answer them as we go. Adarshana is going to be fielding some questions, answering them as we go, and then at the breaks after each part of the presentation, we'll also field some of the questions from the Q&A box. And we also recognize that we aren't necessarily going to have enough time to answer everybody's questions. Some may require us to do a little bit of work behind the scenes to bring forward some good answers. But what we'll do is anything that we don't answer today, we will update our website, our application forms, and the FAQs on our website so that we can address all of your questions. So that is the plan. We're not going to do the raised hand function and speaking, just because of the numbers of people in the group. So please use the Q&A box. There is an opportunity as well to upvote somebody else's question. So if somebody asks a question and you'd also like to hear the answer, please upvote. That'll bring the question higher up because we know there's interest. So thank you for that. And I will shift us over to the first part of our presentation, which is just a general overview of the Watershed Security Fund. And I will turn it over to Jenna to lead us through the first few slides.
Thanks, Jennifer. Yeah, so we just wanted to start off with just a general kind of overview of the Watershed Security Fund. So the Watershed Security Fund is dedicated to safeguarding the health of British Columbia's watersheds for future generations. We're working towards establishing a permanent funding stream that is co-developed and co-governed with First Nations to support building resilient and healthy watersheds across the province. And kind of one of our key kind of messages is water is life and remains the most important environmental, cultural, economic, and spiritual wellspring we share. Go to the next slide. Our mission, the Watershed Security Fund, is to preserve watershed resilience and health through good governance and planning, collaboration, sustainable practices, and community engagement. And by investing in projects that prioritize reconciliation, ecosystem restoration, climate resilience, and sustainable economies, we can ensure that our watersheds remain healthy and vibrant for generations to come. The Watershed Security Fund is a partnership between the Real Estate Foundation of BC, the First Nations Water Caucus, and the First Nations Fisheries Council, with the First Nations Fisheries Council being the secretariat of the First Nations Water Caucus. And we are providing and honored to collaborate as partners in this inspiring, impactful, and healing work and together providing the interim stewardship and support for the co-development of a permanent entity for this very important fund. There's a little bit more information here about the Water Caucus, First Nations Fisheries Council, and the Real Estate Foundation of BC, and I've had a chance to look at the Watershed Security Fund website. There's also some more information there about all three. So we have a commitment to action that provides a non-legally binding framework for REFBC, FNFC, and the First Nations Water Caucus to work together on the timely and effective co-development, implementation, and administration of the Watershed Security Fund. It describes principles, context, oversight, and decision-making structures that align with and support the fund grant agreement. And on the right here, you can see our joint venture structure that we're taking during our time as interim stewards of the fund. So we have our joint executive that is comprised of two representatives from the First Nations Water Caucus. I see there, I think there's a little other stuff, yeah. And then the FNFC Executive Director, as well as we have two representatives from the Board of Directors from REFBC, as well as REFBC CEO. And on the joint executive, we have advisory reps from Waterlands Resource Stewardship from the province there. We then have our joint management committee, which is kind of their technical staff level, as well as several working groups that kind of feed into the joint management committee and the joint executive process there. And as one of our working groups, we have a grants program working group where we have 3 members from the Water Caucus, as well as 4 external members as well, who are our working group members on that. I think that is, pass it to Jennifer.
Thanks, Jenna. So as Jenna mentioned, the composition of our joint executive includes incredible leadership, and we're very delighted to have the following members on the joint executive, including Lydia Whitsom and Hugh Breaker, who are the co-commissioners for the First Nations Water Caucus. Mavis Underwood and Leslie Dickey are the REFBC governors representing on the executive. Mark Gifford is the CEO of REFBC. Jordan Point is the executive director of FNFC, and Stu Barnes is the incoming executive director. And then also, as Jenna mentioned, we have representatives from the Ministry of Waterlands and Resource Stewardship in an advisory role. So this timeline outlines the work that's been done over the last year to get us to this point. The $100 million endowment for the Watershed Security Fund was announced in March 2023. And over the last year, the partners have been focused on creating a strong foundation of co-development at all levels of the work. This has included building relationships between the Water Caucus, REFBC, and FNFC, confirming the commitment to action and a partnership agreement, as well as identifying areas of work and confirming work plans. So the joint executive had its inaugural meeting in December 2023, and then also met in February and March of this year. And while it's not on this timeline, it should add as well that the grants working group had their inaugural meeting in late April, just at the end of April there. So in terms of areas of work, the joint executive have confirmed 8 major areas of work for the fund to support the implementation of the commitment to action. The work plans have now been confirmed for 6 of these areas, each with respective outcomes, objectives, and deliverables. And they include the operations of the joint executive, financial management, investment strategy and management, the grants program, communications, and fund growth. We do have 2 additional areas of work that have been identified, and work plans will be developed early this year, and they include the co-development of the permanent entity and evaluation and learning. And I'll now pass it to Cheyenne to share a little bit about the communications goals for the Watershed Security Fund.
Thank you, Jennifer. Yeah, so for communications, we're really hoping to strengthen a shared understanding of the essential benefits that watersheds provide. We're hoping to do that by telling the story of the work. So working with project teams and communities to bring visibility to their work and tell their story of watershed stewardship. We're also, as we work to grow the fund, communications and marketing are going to be a big part of that to continue to share the importance of this work and the importance of continuing to invest and grow the fund. And we also hope to provide transparency and openness. This is a big journey that we're on, and we want to be clear in our communications and make sure that people have the resources available to them at their fingertips. So I encourage you, if you haven't already done so, to sign up for a newsletter through our website. I'll add in our contact page in the chat. And so the newsletter, this will be one of our main tools to communicate updates on the grants program and developments on the fund. So I do encourage you to sign up. That'll be one of our main places to communicate those updates. And then just behind the scenes, we are working away on creating a more comprehensive platform website that is reflective of our shared work to preserve the health and resilience of our watersheds. And we're also working to create a logo and brand for the Watershed Security Fund. So the website we have up right now, it's a temporary website so that we can get this information and get the initial grants program going, and people can access that information. But do stay tuned. Later this summer, we will be launching the new website and the brand along with that. Thank you, Jennifer.
Great, thank you, Cheyenne. So we can take a few minutes now just to field so many of the questions that have come up. And maybe I'll just check in with Leanne and Adarshana if there's been anything in the Q&A box.
We do have one question. This is more related to funding teams. I'm not sure if you want to answer now or we could do that later as well.
Oh, sure, we can answer it. We can answer it now. That's the only question.
Okay, sounds good. So the question is, one of our teams is land and water-based learning. So is there openness to proposals that include both land and water-based, which includes outdoor learning activities and some classroom learning activities as well? So would we be able to fund such kind of projects?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think we really rely on project teams and communities to design a program that works best for them. And the focus that we show there on land and water-based learning just reflects the fact that from feedback we've heard and impacts we've seen, being out on the ground, in the watersheds, on the water and land is just hugely beneficial for building understanding, connecting elders with youth, technical people and professional people with community people. So that we see that as a really valuable way to engage people in watershed work. We also recognize that classrooms have a value, can be valuable to have in your toolkit. So we're not really rigid in what this looks like, but just some combination of that sounds just fine.
We do have another question, Leanne, if we have some time. This is more on the process of funding. When can we expect more information on the application form guidelines? But I think we do have our application guideline on our website, which we will go in more detail later on in the webinar.
Yeah, that's right. The application form is available on the website right now. There's a Word version that you can download. A few people have maybe had some trouble with their browser accessing it, and Adarshana has been emailing it to people if they're having that trouble. The application guide we're going to put up after this webinar, and it's going to be based partly on what we're sharing today and the questions that we get. And there's also a budget form that's relevant for applications at higher levels of funding, and that's going to be posted on the website in the next couple of days. So yeah, thanks for your patience. We know the intake's opening soon on June 3rd. There's also some information on the website itself that can give some guidance. And we've just been trying to get the materials ready and up as soon as we can. So maybe I see more questions coming in that I think we will be able to answer in the next part of the webinar. So maybe we can carry on and circle back to those if they haven't been answered through the material. Good, okay. So we'll carry on to the next part of the webinar, and that includes an overview of the grants program overall, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more about the application form, the assessment criteria, and the budget form. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and just run through the presentation. Okay. Okay, so this is sort of how we're going to organize this part of the webinar, and we're going to pause after each of the two parts to answer some questions. And as was mentioned earlier, if we can't get to all the questions, we're going to post some FAQs after the webinar today as well. And this webinar itself will also be recorded and available. So for the first part, I'm going to share some of the key elements of our grants program framework, which were based on direction from the Watershed Security Fund governance partners, prior learnings, and the grants working group. And these are some of the key elements here that we're going to run through. Our work on the grants program is guided by this overall vision for a future where flourishing watersheds and the unimpeded flow of water are of the utmost importance, and water is highly valued as the sacred source of life. Our grants program will support work that nourishes our waterways, upholds the strength of Indigenous voices and ways of being in relation to the land and water, and weaves together enduring relationships and partnerships between First Nations and non-First Nations that flow throughout and across watersheds. Funding will meet water stewards and water champions where they are at, building partnerships and collaboration amongst First Nations, local governments, NGOs, and community groups, and scientific communities. Like the natural ebb and flow of our waterways, we will grow and evolve through this work, with water remaining the most important environmental, cultural, economic, and spiritual wellspring that we share. That vision and other key aspects of our grants program were developed in partnership with the Watershed Security Fund Grants Working Group. And that group was convened in April to support and provide direction on the co-development, design, and implementation of the grants program over the coming year. We are very grateful for their leadership and wisdom. They are a diverse group of leaders with deep experience and connection to regional watershed needs and communities across the territories and regions of this province, and they are generously providing their learning and insights to support this work. And as we mentioned earlier, 3 of the members are from the First Nations Water Caucus: Lydia Whitsom, Tina Dulmeister, Dina Meechin, and 3 are from our external members: Brody Guy, Tara Marsden, Tim Morris, and Ione Smith. And they're contributing their own unique perspective and are not representing the views or positions of their respective nation, community, or organization. So this slide here shows our journey over the past year since that initial 100 million commitment was made to get to the point of actually launching a grants program. There was quite a few foundational pieces that had to be put in place that Jennifer described earlier. And once that was done, the Water Caucus and Joint Executive indicated that getting dollars into community as soon as possible was a priority. And so a key focus of the past 2 months has been on designing and preparing to launch our grants program. It's been on a tight timeline with a small staff team, and we have only a modest amount of granting dollars available in this first year. So we're doing our best to bring a good program forward that reflects the seasonal and cyclical nature of watershed work and allows some time for periods of reflection and renewal, learning and ongoing adaptation. And just recognizing it's a little bit tight in these early days. So yeah, thanks for everybody's patience. And we look forward to getting your feedback along the way and continuing to adapt the program as we go. So our grant agreement with the province, combined with a commitment to action agreement and work plans for the fund, are the basis for these key program outcomes, goals, and objectives. Key outcomes for grant funding include reconciliation and advancing UNDRIP, restoring and maintaining ecosystem services and watershed health, climate resiliency, local watershed governance, planning and monitoring initiatives, job creation and economic stimulus, learning and relationship building between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. For our grants program goals and objectives, we want to address urgent and long-term watershed security, health, and resilience through a co-developed grants program that gives communities access to critical funding in supportive, adaptable, timely ways. In the process, we want to share learnings and insights, inspire and help build capacity for new and ongoing work, and build relationships and foundations for the future. Core principles and values that underpin all aspects of the grants program are shown here. We recognize there is a shared reliance and need to work together to care for the natural world and for water. We see the importance of taking a holistic, whole of watershed approach. We recognize that Indigenous title rights and sovereignty are crucial to the health and sustainability of lands and waters, and that Indigenous leadership, voices, and ways of being are crucial in guiding ways forward. We want to show up in this work in a spirit of reciprocity, relationship, and meaningful partnership. We want to honor and respect a diversity of perspectives and move towards new forms of shared decision-making and ways of addressing power imbalances and equity. And we want to take an intergenerational long-term focus. Grant funding is available to support projects and initiatives that prioritize reconciliation, ecosystem health, climate resilience, and sustainable economies in any of these areas of watershed-based work. Watershed collaboration, planning and governance, watershed and ecosystems restoration, nature-based infrastructure projects, watersheds and food systems, monitoring and assessment, and land and water-based learning and knowledge sharing. We also recognize the holistic interwoven aspects of watershed work and understand that most projects will likely connect across several areas. It is also worth noting that our funding is focused on land and freshwater systems within the watershed basins of BC, and marine projects are not a focus for this funding. For now, we have these high-level descriptions for each of the funding themes. And in these early years, we know projects may be limited by our small grants budget. For example, the larger nature-based infrastructure or restoration projects often require millions of dollars in funding. And given some of our smaller grant sizes, this might mean we can only fund a portion of the work, such as planning and design aspects, rather than a full-scale multi-hectare restoration project. But we do hope that we can evolve with a growing fund and a larger annual grants budget in the future. And we can also adapt and potentially focus some of these funding themes more in the future. And if anyone has feedback on these categories that we've identified and the descriptions, we welcome your comments in the chat about that too. So UNDRIP is an overarching priority for the fund, and there are a number of ways we're looking to support that. Teachings from Indigenous leaders and outcomes from previously funded work demonstrate that the most effective means of advancing UNDRIP is for Indigenous-led teams to design and direct projects to the benefit of their nation and members. For non-First Nations-led project teams, upfront partnership development and co-design of project objectives with the nations involved is a key enabler of advancing UNDRIP as well. Additional ways may be through project activities that support the exercise of Indigenous rights, incorporation of Indigenous knowledge, communications and outreach to First Nations leadership, and weaving of Indigenous ceremony, training, rights, and interests into budgets, planning, and activities. And for non-First Nations organizations who are at early stages, there may be other ways they can action commitments through learning and building understanding of First Nations in BC. The review and decision-making process for grant applications will consider many dimensions of a project proposal. And in addition to UNDRIP, we'll look at 5 additional assessment criteria. These are grounded in learnings from prior investments in watersheds and the principles and values that underpin the Watershed Security Fund grants program. And in the application, applicants can briefly describe how their project addresses one or more of these aspects, and they include free, prior, informed consent, equity, community connection, economic resiliency, jobs, training and mentorship, and diversity of interests and collaboration. Our total grants budget envelope for this year is 7 to 10 million. That includes 3 to 5 million from the fund itself, plus a contribution of up to 5 million from the Real Estate Foundation. So available funds in this first year are modest because the goal under the terms of our grant agreement with the province is to keep the initial investment of 100 million whole as an endowment base. We hope there will be additional contributions to the fund in the coming years, either as flow-through dollars, such as those contributed by REFBC this year, or to build the endowment base itself, with a goal of actually achieving a base of $1 billion that could grant out around 75 million annually. So that's the longer term goal for now. Our grants budget of 7 to 10 million will be allocated across 2 open call application intakes in 2024-25. We have our first intake opening in June, on June 3rd to 26th, and that will be for grants to be approved in September, with funds flowing starting in October. And then the second intake will open in late 2024 or early 2025 for grants approved next spring. For the first intake, we anticipate allocating approximately 1/3 of the 2024 funding, and for the second intake, approximately 2/3, and there's some flexibility there. Funded projects do not need to spend their grant funding within a specific fiscal year, and applications can be made for short-term projects or multi-year projects of up to 3 years, with the option to extend timelines if needed. Funded work can start anytime after grants are approved. The timing and scale of these intakes does reflect a sense of urgency and responsibility to address pressing watershed needs as soon as possible, while also recognizing the short runway to June. So we know it's a bit short notice for project teams to prepare proposals, and that's why we're allocating, about 1/3 of the budget for this first intake and saving a larger portion for the second intake when people have a bit more time to prepare applications. And so given our small initial budget, we are taking a scaled developmental approach with 3 funding streams that support a range of project sizes at different stages. And we hope this can enable some continuity of funding for organizations and projects that are well on their way with a foundation of prior work, and also offer resources to others at earlier stages of project conception, design, research, or relationship building. So we have these 3 streams. Stream 1, headwaters, for applications of up to $50,000. And stream 2, creek, applications of up to $150,000. And stream 3, river, applications up to $500,000. Decisions on how many projects will be funded in each of the streams have not been made and will depend on the mix of applications we receive. Just for illustrative purposes, with this year's budget, we can conceive or imagine potentially funding about 50 projects that would be across the 2 intakes combined, with a mix of grant sizes. And once again, we realize it's not a lot of dollars compared to the enormous needs in community and the high cost of restoration work, but it's the best we can do as we're starting out. So eligible organizations for our grant funding include Indigenous or non-Indigenous nonprofits, educational institutions, and social enterprises, as well as First Nations, including First Nations governments, tribal councils, and others, and local and regional governments. Our eligibility is not restricted to Canada Revenue Agency registered charities or qualified donees. And in addition to those listed above, some other types of organizations may be eligible. And there are a number of things we are not able to fund, and those are shown on the left-hand side of this slide and also listed in the application form and on our website. So in alignment with our principles, we do want our grants program to be approachable, accessible, adaptable, and supportive, and grounded in good relationships, trust, and partnerships with the project teams and applicants we're working with. There are several ways that we can provide support and guidance to potential applicants, and that includes through the information on our website, our application guide and FAQs, which we're hoping to update and get out as soon as we can, through these webinars themselves, which are being recorded and will be available on our website, and through emails, phone calls, and other connections with our program staff that can be arranged through Adarshana, our grants program coordinator. We're also offering 3 different ways you can apply for a grant. Our online portal will be opening on June 3rd, and that can be accessed through a link on the Watershed Security Fund Grants website page. If you'd like, you can also download our Word document, complete it in a Word format, and PDF it and send it into our grants coordinator, Adarshana, and the email address is there. And then you can also arrange a Zoom or Teams or FaceTime or phone call and do your application through kind of an interview format with one of our program staff. If you reach out to Adarshana about that, she'll connect you with someone, and we just ask you to leave lots of time for that so that there can be some back and forth, and we can make sure that what we capture in the interview reflects what you'd like to see brought forward in your application. So in the next part of the presentation, I am going to go through the funding application itself with a bit more detail and include some of our assessment criteria and the budget form. But before I'll do that, I'll just pause here for some questions from Adarshana and Jennifer. And Jenna is also going to help answer some of those. So I'll stop sharing my screen for that.
I can post one question, Leanne. Is there a certain amount of fund allocated to each of the funding teams? And will a project be more likely to receive funding for certain types of work?
Yeah, so of those 6 funding themes that we showed in the circle, we're not setting funding targets. We're not allocating a certain amount for infrastructure projects and a certain amount for land-based learning. They're really just there to describe the range and the type of work that we could potentially be funding that's relevant to the outcomes and criteria and goals for the fund. They're also there just to help illustrate the important types of work that do support watershed security and will help us in our grants program communications as we kind of categorize some projects and share stories of the work in these different categories. It helps the broader community understand the type of work that we're trying to do. And then it can also help us group the way we describe outcomes and activities in our reporting out and as we share the story of the work. So we don't have targets for them. They're really just to capture the range of work we're hoping to fund, and we'll look to hear from project teams about what's most pressing for them right now and what work they want to do.
Leanne, I've got a question here in the Q&A box that I'd like to share.
Okay.
And a few people have this question, and that is that if we submit an application to the first intake and are not successful, is there an opportunity to receive feedback and apply to the second intake with a similar proposal or with a new and different proposal?
Yeah, absolutely. You can, any organization can make one application in each intake. So if you've got multiple projects, certainly as we're starting out, we just ask that you choose one project for an application intake. And just because we're going to be fielding a lot of applications, and we'll just ask you to choose the one that's of most interest to you and that you feel kind of best aligns with the different funding streams and other criteria of the fund. And so, it is also possible that, because we have a smaller grants budget in this first intake, yeah, we won't be able to fund everything. So some of the strong proposals can also be brought forward to the second intake. Did I miss anything there, Jenna?
I don't think so. Yeah, we're definitely open to trying to be as helpful as possible with the intake. So providing any feedback as we can, and given capacity, what that kind of looks like. But just to help with kind of prepping for the second intake. And yeah.
Great.
Thanks. And I have a question here that may, Jenna, you might be able to help with, or Leanne. If a nation plans to use consultants to conduct the majority of the work, does that impact project eligibility?
A great question. I can start, Leanne can add. No, I don't see that impacting project eligibility. Each First Nation will have different capacity and what's available to them. So if consultants are needed to do some of the work, that's definitely welcome.
Yeah, and I would just say, the main thing we'd be looking at, regardless of who's doing the work, whether it's or partnering to support the work, whether it's a consultant or another NGO or local government, is that criteria that we have around community connection. We just want to make sure that the people involved in the project that are being funded for the project do really have a meaningful connection to the community itself and the work and priorities of the community that the work is intended to support.
Great, thanks. We do have a lot of questions in the Q&A box, and we've got about 5 more minutes for this part. But as we said earlier, anything we can't get to, we will be updating the FAQs. But I will ask a few more questions here. There's a question here of if many communities plan to work together on a Stream 3 application, can the individual communities also apply under Stream 1 or 2 by themselves?
Okay, that's a good question. Okay, let me just, so you can be a partner on an application made by another organization. And you can, in that case, if you're a partner, a funded partner, but another organization is bringing forward the application, you are also able to submit your own application, and you may have a variety of different partners for a different kind of a project. So the general thinking is like an organization can bring forward a project. And yeah, we understand that a lot of this work is collaborative and people are involved in multiple projects in their watershed basin. So yeah, you can definitely make an application even though you're a partner on another project of your, another separate application. I hope that was clear enough. Jenna, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think you covered it all.
Okay.
Yeah, we're just given, as Leanne mentioned, that we have modest amount of funding, trying to spread that as far as we possibly can with those dollars.
Great, thanks. The next question for you both is, would the fund support the building of infrastructure meant to support projects related to the different funding themes?
Okay, I think this is getting at maybe some of the like capital expenses related to a project. Like, I don't know if maybe they're thinking of buildings or something. But I'm going to touch on the budget and allowable expenses a bit in the next section, but generally, we allow for up to 25% of a project budget to be for capital purchases or expenses, but large scale purchase or development of land and buildings is not eligible for the fund. We just don't have the dollars for those kinds of higher costs.
Then I'll move to the next question, which is around the definition of the word partner. Does the definition of partner mean that there would need to be budget items allocated to that partner?
The application form gives you an opportunity to describe various different types of partnerships. So a partnership wouldn't necessarily require that actual budget be going to that partner. You know, it could be more for information sharing, or it could be a deeper partnership where two organizations are co-developing, co-designing a project, and funding is supporting both of their teams and costs. So there's a range of scenarios that the work can fund. I think the main thing to maybe also consider is just that one of the questions we will be asking about is your organizational relationship to First Nations. And there's a matrix that we use as a guideline for defining and helping people understand where they fit on sort of a continuum of is your work, you know, first of all, are you a First Nations led organization and project, or are you a First Nations partnered initiative and involving a First Nations and a non-First Nation? At that kind of a partnership on that continuum, we're looking for that deeper like leadership and decision making being shared, likely project expenses being shared and that sort of thing. So on that definition, the way that partnership Indigenous partnered is being looked at is quite involved, and that matrix gives some guidelines around that, and we will talk about that a little bit more in the next part of the presentation, and that'll be something to look at if people are wondering about that aspect of the application and the questions.
Great. Thank you. So I think we have time for two more questions, and then we'll move on to the next part of the presentation. This next question, several people were interested in the answer, and that is, will this fund also be available to support ongoing projects that are already being implemented?
So there's opportunities through this funding to support projects that have a strong foundation of work behind them and kind of well on their way. And there's also opportunity for projects or communities that are just starting their watershed work and don't have a lot of prior work, but maybe they're just looking to do some peer learning with other communities that have done watershed work. They're having engagement in their own community about their priorities and needs and that kind of thing. So there's various different opportunities, and the different streams of funding have slightly different kinds of focus around that. We're kind of taking a developmental approach. So for some of the smaller grants, you know, that strong foundation of prior work really isn't needed. For the larger grants, we might be looking to see deeper partnerships, prior work, and readiness to really implement on the ground. That kind of shovel ready, ready to go kind of work. Jenna, is there anything that I missed there that you want to add?
No, I don't think so. I think you covered it all.
Okay.
Great. Okay, I'll ask one last question here before we go to the next piece. Did you say that projects that focus on marine and ocean ecosystems will not be considered?
Yes, the focus of this funding is on freshwater systems. There's obviously some projects where there's going to be a intersection of those ecosystems, but for the most part, we're looking at watershed basin, land, and freshwater systems. Jenna, do you have anything to add on that? Okay.
Okay, so I think we'll move to the next part of the presentation. If you had ongoing questions, anyone had after hearing the response to the original question, feel free to ask a clarifying question in the chat and the Q&A box, and we can always add a more fulsome response in our FAQs. So I'll turn it over to you, Leanne.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer, and thanks to everybody for your really good questions and all the thought that's going into understanding this grants program. We really appreciate it, and it's great to have everyone together to hear some of the questions as a group, as I'm sure many of them are similar. So I'll just go ahead and share my screen again, and we'll go through the next part. Okay, so for this next part of the webinar, I'm going to run through the application form itself and provide some background and guidance on the rationale for some of the questions, and then we can touch on eligible expenses and the application budget form. And whether you're applying online or submitting a Word application by email or developing an application through the online interview conversation with one of our staff, we do really recommend that you download the Word version of the application form as a tool to kind of do some of your prep and early thinking. There's some good guidance throughout the form itself and also on the budget form, which is going to be available to download from our website within the next day or two. So the application form starts off by asking for some basic information about your organization and contact information. And then in addition, as part of our commitment to UNDRIP, we do ask applicants to identify their organizational relationship to First Nations in BC using a matrix called the I4DM that was developed by the Circle on Philanthropy. And I was referring to that earlier when we were fielding that question around partnerships. So on the application form, we provide a link to information on the matrix, and we ask project teams to familiarize themselves with it so they can self-identify their relationship to First Nations, or they can let us know if they don't currently have a relationship. And I think, Darshana, you were going to put that link in the chat now. We also have a link to a great article on how various organizations have used the I4DM and found it helpful. So Darshana can pop that in the chat too, and we can include that in our FAQs afterwards as well. So just looking at the matrix itself in a little bit more detail and our reasons for why we want to look at it is we know that Indigenous title rights and sovereignty are crucial to the health and sustainability of lands and waters in the unceded and or treaty territories across what is referred to as British Columbia. As the inherent rights holders of these lands and waters who have protected and cared for them for millennia, First Nations really must have a central role in this work if we are to uphold UNDRIP commitments and achieve some of the transformational change that's needed towards healthy, secure watersheds. At the same time, it's also recognized that repairing the harms of 150 years of colonial impacts can't fall solely on the shoulders of First Nations. There's many groups that are ready to do important work alongside of First Nations, and we know there's a shared reliance and need to care for the natural world and water that we all depend on. Relationships between Indigenous people and organizations, NGOs, colonial governments, industry, and local communities are all essential now and in the future. So enabling diverse interests to support and strengthen watershed security is an important part of this work, and it is reflected in our funding priorities and eligibility guidelines as well. So across the three funding streams, at higher levels of funding, there will be some prioritization of projects. led by organizations who are generally further along that continuum towards the First Nations-led, partnered, or informed work. Right now on this slide, we're showing some general guidelines around that, and these aren't specific. We don't have specific funding targets and percentages right now. Our overall goal is to center Indigenous voices, experiences, approaches, and leadership, while also making space for resourcing important work of non-Indigenous-led initiatives that also contribute to holistic, collaborative, shared ways forward for addressing watershed needs. On the application form, after the organizational information, section 2 gives an opportunity to describe your project or initiative and how it addresses watershed health and security, including relevant prior or future work. We also ask applicants to identify up to 2 funding themes or areas of work that are most relevant to your project, and those are the funding themes I mentioned earlier. Again, we know many projects will touch on many of these. The choosing of the project themes isn't being used to prioritize applications. It's just being used to show and understand the types of work that's included. We also ask people to indicate which water basin and territories their project activities will take place in, so we can understand and document the geographic distribution of funds and project work. So yeah, you can choose one of these regions, or for projects that are in more than one basin, you have an opportunity to describe that as well. So there is some similar data available for the Indigenous Watersheds Initiative projects and from the Healthy Watersheds Initiative projects. And by collecting this kind of data, we can start to see the evolving picture of funded watershed work by watershed basins. We also know it's not a complete picture, and we do hope to better understand the complex funding landscape in BC and to help identify some of the needs, gaps, and potential opportunities to dovetail with complementary funding programs in the future. For this year, we're going to do our best to consider regional equity in funding decisions, including listening to applicants' experience and understanding of their community impacts and needs. We know that more thorough research and gap analysis could be planned and resourced in the coming year for the purpose of potentially prioritizing certain regions or basins. Another idea that we have is to try to offer some facilitated support to applicants and funded organizations regarding other available funding sources. That's going to take a bit of time for us to resource. So that's something that could potentially be coming down later this year or future years. What we do know now is that funding needs far surpass available dollars, and we need to rely on a number of different assessment approaches in our review, shortlisting, and decision making to make decisions on that support regional equity in the distribution of funds, and that's not easy. For project information, we also ask applicants to indicate which funding stream they're applying within based on their amount requested in their application, and to tell us the project duration for which funding is requested and their project start date. Projects can be short-term or multi-year and up to 3 years, and funding is not tied to a particular fiscal year. So section 3 of the application is an opportunity for organizations to describe their approach to advancing UNDRIP. Using a framework developed by Tar Marsden, the application form gives First Nations the option of providing their distinct perspective on UNDRIP in relation to their project. And non-First Nations-led organizations are asked to describe how they're planning to action UNDRIP in 5 or 6 key ways. And in addition to helping us understand and assess projects for funding, successful applicants can report out on these commitments once their work is underway or completed, and we can better understand and share collective progress to advance UNDRIP over time. Section 4 of the application touches on the additional assessment criteria or lenses that we discussed earlier in part 1, and applicants have the option of speaking to one or more of these in relation to their project. This slide here provides some additional background on why we feel these aspects are important and relevant to the work. So we ask about free, prior, informed consent because we recognize Indigenous people's right to determine and develop priorities and strategies for the development or use of their lands or territories and other resources as described in under Article 32. We ask questions to understand equity considerations because our grant funding is intended to support projects that advance sustainable, equitable, and socially just land use and watershed stewardship. We recognize that some regions experience particular challenges or barriers in accessing water-related funding or other resources and may be at greater risk from climate or cumulative impacts. And we want to give project teams an opportunity to tell us how their communities may be affected. We ask about community connection because we believe communities have a deep understanding of their own needs, priorities, and solutions, and community-connected projects support important trust building, accountability, and shared responsibilities over the long term. We're interested in economic resiliency, jobs, training, and mentorship, as these are valued outcomes of watershed work with many interrelated community benefits, which we want to support. And for certain types of projects, ensuring a diversity of interests are involved in collaborative approaches may be particularly relevant, especially when working across jurisdictions or to support shared learning. So depending on the scale and nature of the project work and whether it's just getting started or is further along, some projects may just address one or two of these areas and others may address many of them. So a range of project partnerships may also be relevant to your project, and we have questions on those. Partnerships can be an indicator of collaboration and community connection or an organization's relationship to First Nations. However, we're not going to be evaluating proposals based on the number of partners. We're really just more interested in the quality or nature of your partnership, and so we have some questions on the application form about that. And letters of support from partners are optional but not required, and they can be in email format or provided as copies of letters of support addressed or submitted to other funders. So Section 6 of the application focuses on the budget and asks for the amount of funding being requested and some other related budget information. It includes a list of eligible expenses. So eligible expenses include staffing and labor costs, program or project planning, design, delivery, coordination, communications, consultant fees, convening and relationship building, workshop and travel costs, costs for Indigenous ceremony and cultural protocols, honoraria, building cultural competency, and admin of up to 10%. And we really encourage project budgets to include allocations to support engagement with elders, youth, and ceremony, and also for communications and sharing the story of your project work. I think, as I mentioned earlier, site costs and project-related capital purchases are eligible with some limitations, which are explained on the budget form. And for projects in Stream 1, that's the headwaters stream with grants under $50,000 or up to $50,000, we only ask for a summary description of how the funds would be used for project expenses. And that's on the application form itself. For projects in Stream 2, up to 150,000, in Stream 3, up to 500,000, there is a budget form that's going to be available on the website in the next day or two, and we ask you to download and complete that as part of your application. My next slide is going to show part of that form. There are some other options around providing your budget as part of the application. If you reach out to a Darshana well in advance of the deadline, there may be other options, such as submitting a budget form that you previously prepared for another funding program in lieu of our budget template. We would just ask that you allow plenty of time so we can jointly ensure it does provide the information we need to receive and review your budget information. And just another note about matching funding. Matching funding has been identified as a barrier for many organizations doing watershed work. It can be difficult to coordinate matching funding. Matching funding can be uncertain. And other sources of confirmed matching funding are not required for your grant application. But we would say for projects that up to 500,000 in stream 3, that's the river category, they're good to see. And in stream 3 creek, they're of interest. It does help us understand how the funding is being leveraged. And it also helps us understand, how our funding might be contributing to a bigger project. And as part of project reporting, we will be interested in knowing about other sources of funding that you do end up confirming across any of the streams, just to help us see, again, that leveraging or how our funding is being complemented, and so we can understand and share those insights about the funding landscape for the watershed sector overall. But it's not again, it's not something we require, it's just of interest. So this is a part of the budget form. There's a sort of a simple revenues section at the top, and then this Excel form provides a template for the expense part of your budget. There's several categories of expenses which may be relevant to your project. You're not required to have expenses in all of these categories, but all of them are eligible. And we also have a section for other expenses in case the categories we've chosen just don't really fit with how you see your project expenses. So for staff and contract wages, we just ask you to list the type and number of positions and total expense for each, including mercs and benefits if that's applicable. We also ask you to provide an estimate for the number of full-time, full-year positions. Those can be staff or contracted, and the estimated number of seasonal or part-time positions, and those can be staff or contracted. We're not looking for tons of details on number of hours. We're really just looking for an estimate. Examples of eligible site costs include rental of equipment, vehicles and boats, construction materials such as soil, concrete, plant materials, shovels, site fencing or storage that stays on site, fuel or delivery costs for site prep activities, travel to and from the site, water sampling, processing, production of maps, and drone footage, just as some examples. And then capital purchases I mentioned earlier, those are allowed for those that are necessary to the project, and they can add to the organization's asset base beyond the project timeframe, but typically they shouldn't exceed 25% of project expenses. So examples might include IT hardware or software. Those are typically not to exceed 10% of project expenses, or the purchase of equipment that stays with the applicant organization after the project, such as some vehicles, survey instruments, radio receivers, water monitoring equipment. And that's typically not to exceed 15% of project expenses. Under engagement costs, we do encourage applicants to include budget for ceremony and protocol, such as honoraria for individuals or recognition of host nations, for training and peer learning, evaluation and reporting, and project communications, including storytelling materials, photographers, videographers, and other costs to create or supply some of your written and visual digital content. Yeah, and then like I said, we have that other category and allow for admin up to 10%. And that can be for overhead expenses such as board expenses, accounting, audit, legal fees, office space and operations, and other kinds of admin costs. And then in the final section of the application, you have the option of providing some additional information if you like, such as videos or website links. And we give some guidance on how to submit supplementary documents if you want to. And we give you an opportunity to let us know if you'd like to be added to a list of people to be notified of future potential learning opportunities related to UNDRIP, watershed engagement, and learning events and funding supports. As we've mentioned, we're still in the early stages of developing our grants funding program, but in the future, we hope to be able to offer some resources engagement opportunities for applicants, grantees, and people working in the watershed sector. So if you want to put your name on that list, we hope to reach out in the future. And as a final word, I just want to acknowledge that we know these applications are a lot of work, and it can be challenging and frustrating with all the different formats, timelines, and different interests from different funding programs. We really appreciate the work that you do, the critical work that you do, and we hope we're being as clear and transparent as possible. We welcome feedback as people learn about the program and go through the application process. And just really appreciate you taking the time to be here with us today, learn about the program, and to your shared commitment to this really important, inspiring, impactful, and healing work. So thank you so much. And we'll wrap up the presentations and take some more questions.
Thank you, Leanne, for the good overview. We've been receiving some questions in the past few weeks. I'll get started with one of the questions. What would be the reporting structure for a WSFP? Will it be after 6 months or a year? And how much detail would we expect to provide in the project reporting? I can ask Jenna to answer that.
Sadarshana. So we typically look for a project update or reporting once a year. We'll be working with the grants working group out over the next few months to design the reporting and shared learning approach for the grants program, and hope to share more information on this soon. In alignment with our values and principles, we don't want project reporting to be an undue burden for project teams. So listening to, responding to, and amplifying the voices and experiences of project teams and sharing the stories of work, learnings, and outcomes will be the primary goal.
Thank you, Jenna. I can pose one more question. If your organization is not a First Nation-led organization, would it be better to understand UNDRIP, and how can we build relationship, understanding with First Nations in BC? Do we have any advice or resources we would like to share? Maybe Jenna or Leanne, whoever wants to address this question.
Thanks, Adarshana. Jenna, I can jump in and can add to it. Yeah, many organizations are at different places in terms of their relationship to First Nations and understanding around advancing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. There are some really, really good resources out there for learning that you can do on your own or through webinars or other more interactive opportunities. We do recommend you start by learning about the host nation in the watershed that you're working in, and do as much as you can around that. And then there's also some other good resources that were produced through the Healthy Watersheds Initiative that might be of interest. There was a report prepared by Tara Marsden, our Senior Indigenous Advisor to the Healthy Watersheds Initiative, on UNDRIP and our evaluation framework and report. And there's Adarshana might be able to pop a link in the chat to that resource. Also, in that same part of our Healthy Watersheds Initiative website page, we've got some UNDRIP posters that were developed for the HWI symposium that talk about different articles of UNDRIP and how those articles were advanced or related to the watershed security work funded through HWI. So it's just kind of neat to see those applied ways that project teams advanced UNDRIP. And then there's some great workshops offered by many organizations. Nahanni Creative is one of them. They provided for HWI some decolonizing watersheds workshops, and their final report is also on the HWI website. Darshana could share that link. And then just finally, on our REFBC website, we have a webinar recording of a great webinar that was produced called UNDRIP and You. What does UNDRIP mean for your organization? And featuring a number of different speakers and perspectives on that. So there's a few resources and just really encourage groups to explore what works for them. Yeah, it's been one of the most meaningful parts of my learning over the past 5 years. And I'm just really grateful for how generous many of the Indigenous advisors and leaders have been in sharing their knowledge and experience, and also recognize that it's important to do my own work on my own time as well to complement and just to be a good listener. So there's a few insights I can share. Jenna, do you want to add to that?
I don't think I have too much to add. Definitely the resources are helpful, and yeah, listening and understanding the areas that you're in and you're working around, the communities that are there, and building connections and meaningful relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks.
I'll share a couple of questions from the Q&A, and perhaps